In the middle of Manhattan's most luxurious store, a manager slapped a black woman in front of 80 shocked customers, but what he didn't know was that she owned the entire empire he worked for. What happened next would change everything. Have you ever seen a man end his career with one hand? The words echo like a prophecy in a place built for elegance, not ruin. It was a Saturday afternoon at Lux Fashion's Manhattan flagship, the kind of day when crystal chandeliers spilled light across marble floors and the hum of wealth filled every corner. Shoppers in designer coats drifted from rack to rack, the air scented with cologne and soft jazz floating overhead. Children clutched their parents' hands, their laughter mixing with the clink of champagne glasses offered to VIP customers. It was a portrait of luxury, a temple of exclusivity. And then, in a single instant, that illusion shattered. Brad Hutchinson, store manager in a suit as polished as the marble beneath him, raised his hand and let it fly across Zara Williams's face. The slap rang out sharp and brutal, cutting through the music like a gunshot. The sound echoed against glass displays and mirrored walls, loud enough to stop 50 people mid-step. A gasp surged through the store as if the entire crowd had inhaled at once. One little girl whimpered, then burst into tears, clinging to her mother's leg as the woman pulled her close, shielding her eyes from the violence she should never have seen. Phones emerged in an instant. Screens lit up like weapons drawn, trembling hands holding them steady as shoppers captured what had just happened. A sea of red recording dots glared back at Brad, every angle of his action preserved forever. Security cameras blinked silently from the ceiling, bearing witness to. "Get your ghetto ass out of my store before I call the police." Brad spat, venom dripping from every syllable. His words cut just as deep as the slap, poisonous and ugly against the backdrop of luxury. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. Zara did not move, she did not stumble, she did not raise her voice. Her tailored blazer stayed perfectly pressed, her leather briefcase balanced effortlessly in her hand. Only her palm rose, slow and measured, to touch the burning mark across her cheek. Her eyes lifted to meet Brad's, and though she said nothing, something flickered there, something cold, dangerous, and unyielding. The silence was unbearable. Even the jazz from the speakers seemed to retreat, fading into the background as if the music itself refused to play after such a scene. Shoppers held their breath, a fragile stillness pressing down on the room. Everyone knew they had just seen more than a slap. They had seen a man cross a line that could never be uncrossed. In those first seconds, the crowd didn't yet know who Zara Williams was. To them, she was simply a black woman standing alone in a luxury store, struck across the face for daring to exist where someone like Brad thought she didn't belong. But the stillness in her posture, the steadiness of her breathing, the way her eyes locked on him without blinking, these things hinted at a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Brad, chest heaving, seemed almost triumphant in his cruelty. He mistook her silence for weakness. He mistook the frozen crowd for approval. But the trembling red lights of dozens of phone cameras told a different story. Already, this moment was escaping the marble walls, slipping into the endless veins of social media, spreading like fire. 100 strangers would soon become thousands, then hundreds of thousands, watching, judging, remembering. A career ended not in boardrooms or quarterly reports, but in a single act of arrogance and hate. And still, Zara did not speak. Her silence was not surrender, it was a warning. 10 minutes before the slap, the store was alive with the usual hum of luxury. The customer service counter gleamed beneath soft golden lights, its polished surface reflecting the line of well-heeled shoppers waiting to resolve their purchases. Associates moved quickly, their practiced smiles reserved for the faces they believed mattered. The air smelled faintly of Italian leather and expensive perfume, every detail curated to whisper wealth. Zara Williams stood in line, her posture calm, a briefcase resting against her leg. She had walked in with a simple task: return a defective handbag worth $3,200, a piece she had purchased only 3 days earlier. The zipper was already broken, the stitching unraveling in a way no luxury good should. She had no intention of making a scene, no desire to be remembered, just efficiency, a conversation with corporate about quality control, and then on to her next meeting. It should have taken 10 minutes. Instead, she was still standing there 20 minutes later, untouched, unseen. A young blonde associate had greeted her with a cool politeness that froze into something else the moment she saw Zara's skin, the cut of her blazer, the quiet certainty in her voice. The receipt had been taken without warmth, the words "manager approval required" delivered with a rehearsed finality, as if daring Zara to argue. And so Zara waited. She waited as one white woman with a nearly identical handbag appeared at the counter 5 minutes later and was refunded in under 2. She waited as another customer, laughing with her friend, returned a pair of shoes and received not only her money back but a gift card for the inconvenience. Zara watched it all in silence, the imbalance written in small, humiliating details, the sidelong glances, the whispered exchanges between associates. The way her presence seemed to make them busy themselves with tasks that didn't exist. Her eyes flicked to the large clock above the entrance. She had a board meeting scheduled in less than half an hour, 6 blocks away. Every minute wasted here was a minute stolen from a room where her voice mattered. Still, she waited. A young man in line behind her muttered under his breath, impatient, as though Zara's presence at the counter was somehow the reason for the delay. She did not turn to respond. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the briefcase, and in that small movement, the cuff of her sleeve shifted back. For a split second, the face of a custom Rolex glinted under the light, diamonds catching the gold glow of the chandeliers. A few people nearby noticed, their eyes lingering before quickly darting away. It was a silent contradiction to the assumption that she was out of place here. When her phone buzzed, she checked the screen. A reminder, board meeting at 2:30. She had exactly 10 minutes left before she would need to leave. She placed the phone back into her briefcase. And as she did, a card case shifted, the edge of a platinum Centurion card flashing in the light. It was there and gone in an instant, but the symbol was unmistakable to anyone who knew. Few did. The associate at the counter either did not notice or chose not to care. Her eyes swept Zara from head to toe with a professional smile that no longer masked the dismissal beneath. The line continued to move for everyone else. 2 more customers came and went. Their problems solved swiftly, their money returned with apologies and extras. Zara remained untouched. A pressure built in the room, invisible but suffocating. The injustice was not subtle anymore. It was blatant, shameless, conducted in plain view of 50 people who mostly pretended not to see, yet her composure did not crack. Her hand stayed steady on the briefcase, her voice unused. She had learned long ago that silence could be more dangerous than fury. The clock ticked louder in her ears. 20 minutes lost, 20 minutes of patience stretched to its limit. And then, at last, the manager emerged. Brad Hutchinson. His suit sharp, his cologne heavy, his smile thin and patronizing, he walked with the swagger of a man convinced he owned the floor beneath him. His eyes flicked over Zara once, and in that glance there was no welcome, only disdain. He stepped to the counter, his words already sharpened before they left his mouth. What seemed at first like inconvenience was about to turn into something far worse. Brad Hutchinson adjusted his tie as he strode toward the counter, his shoes clicking against the marble as though each step announced authority. He didn't look at Zara when he first spoke, instead staring down at the handbag on the counter like it was an insult to his store. His tone was the kind that dripped condescension, polished enough to sound professional, but sharp enough to cut. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, though the words came more like an accusation than an invitation. Zara's voice was calm, steady, and professional. "I purchased this 3 days ago. The craftsmanship is subpar. I'd like to return it and discuss the quality issue with your corporate office." Brad picked up the bag, turning it slowly, deliberately, as if each second wasted was a message. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You probably damaged this yourself." He muttered loudly enough for people nearby to hear. "Too much junk stuffed inside, maybe. We can't take back merchandise that customers have abused." Zara stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on him, her posture unshaken. Her silence unnerved him, though he covered it with another smirk. He leaned closer, lowering his voice in a way that made it cut sharper. "Look, lady, we see this all the time. People buy things they can't really afford, then get buyer's remorse when reality hits." His words floated out into the air like poison, meant to humiliate, meant to remind everyone within earshot of the invisible lines he believed defined worth. Shoppers nearby shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Zara, then back at Brad. One mother pulled her daughter a little closer, sensing something ugly unraveling. Zara's phone buzzed in her hand, a reminder flashing across the screen, board meeting at 2:30. She had minutes left. But Brad's disdain didn't pause. He raised his voice now, letting it carry beyond the counter, letting it reach the growing circle of customers. "Sure you can afford it," he sneered, his eyes sweeping over her with a dismissive glance. "Maxed out credit cards, maybe, trying to impress people at your job. We know your type." The words hit like stones, and the silence that followed was heavier than the chandeliers above. A few shoppers gasped softly. The crowd thickened. Phones slowly lifting higher, recording, documenting. Among them stood Riley Chen, a fashion blogger with 12,000 followers. She whispered into her phone, the red circle of her live stream glowing as she angled it toward Brad and Zara. "Y'all, something crazy is happening at Lux Fashion right now. This manager is being totally racist to this woman." Within seconds, comments began to flood her screen. "What's happening? This is disgusting. Get his name, record, everything." The energy in the room shifted. What had been a private humiliation was becoming a public spectacle. Brad didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He was too busy fueling his own arrogance. He stepped closer to Zara, invading her space, his voice rising. "Listen here, we don't cater to people who walk into upscale stores thinking they deserve special treatment. This isn't Walmart. We have standards here." And then it came, the sentence that stripped away all pretense. "We see it all the time with people like you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, bitter and impossible to ignore. The crowd inhaled sharply, some shaking their heads, others whispering in disbelief. Riley's livestream spiked, 5,000 viewers, then 10, then 20. Comments scrolled so fast they blurred. "Fired, racist. Get his name, cancel Lux Fashion." Zara didn't flinch. Her blazer remained smooth, her briefcase steady, her eyes locked on Brad's face as if memorizing every detail for later. Her silence grew heavier than any argument she could make. It wasn't just Brad against her anymore. It was Brad against the crowd, against the cameras, against the thousands of unseen witnesses watching through their screens, and the numbers kept climbing. The court of public opinion had been summoned, and its trial had just begun. The shrill ring of the store's internal phone sliced through the tense silence. An associate with trembling hands lifted the receiver, whispered urgently, and within minutes the message had traveled to a midtown office where Janet Morrison, regional manager, was reviewing quarterly reports. Her assistant's voice was tight with panic. "There's a situation at store 47. The manager, it's going viral." Janet's stomach dropped. Store 47 was the crown jewel of the chain. The Manhattan flagship, the location corporate guarded like treasure. She was out the door in seconds, heels striking the pavement, rehearsing lines in her head. By the time she arrived, the store was no longer a sanctuary of marble and chandeliers. It was a stage, and every shopper had become part of the audience. Phones hovered in the air like torches. The tension hung thick, heavy with unspoken judgment. At the center stood Zara Williams, motionless, calm. Her presence steady against Brad's bluster. Janet's eyes darted to the live-stream screens already broadcasting to tens of thousands. Every second mattered now, every word could explode into a headline. She smoothed her jacket, fixed a smile that strained at the edges, and stepped into the circle. "What exactly is going on here?" she demanded, her voice pitched to project authority. Brad exhaled in visible relief, as if reinforcements had arrived. "Janet, thank God. This woman became belligerent when we refused her fraudulent return. She's disruptive, aggressive." He spun the story quickly, confident that hierarchy would shield him. Janet raised a hand to quiet him, then turned to Zara with a professional courtesy she hadn't offered anyone else in years. "Ma'am, I apologize for any confusion. I'm Janet Morrison, regional manager. Perhaps we can resolve this quietly in my office." Resolve, quietly. Words chosen like bandages for a wound she hoped to hide rather than heal. The crowd shifted uneasily. They knew what they had seen. The slap, the insults, the venom, and now here was a polished executive trying to fold it into corporate paperwork. Zara's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, though it never touched her eyes. Quietly she repeated, her voice calm but carrying across the store. "Your manager struck me across the face in front of 50 witnesses. This isn't confusion. This is assault." The word landed like a stone thrown into still water. Ripples spread through the crowd, whispers rising, phones angling closer. Janet blinked, her smile faltering, a thin crack in her composure. "Let's not escalate," she said quickly, her gaze flicking nervously to the cameras. "I'm sure we can find a solution acceptable to both sides." Zara tilted her wrist, eyes flicking to the timepiece that gleamed under the lights. A custom Rolex, rare, unmistakable. The second hand swept with quiet precision. She sighed softly, a sound so controlled it felt rehearsed, then murmured words that sent a chill through the room. "I don't have time for this nonsense." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. But the delivery was absolute, dismissing the chaos around her with the ease of someone accustomed to bigger battles. For a moment, the store itself seemed to lean closer, straining to understand who this woman was, this customer who stood so unshaken while managers scrambled and reputations unraveled. Brad's eyes flickered uneasily. Janet's confidence wavered. The crowd felt it too, that this was no ordinary sharper, no powerless victim. Something else was at play, something just beyond their grasp. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. The question was no longer whether Zara would endure their treatment. The question was how long it would take for everyone in the room to realize who, exactly, they were dealing with. The customer service counter no longer felt like a place to process returns. It had transformed into a stage, every detail illuminated beneath the unforgiving light of dozens of phone cameras. 80 people stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces glowing from their screens, capturing every breath, every word, every gesture. The marble floor gleamed like a spotlight, reflecting the tension that filled the air. Brad Hutchinson shifted uneasily, but he held onto his arrogance like a shield. Janet Morrison kept her voice calm, trying to steady the situation, but her eyes betrayed the panic of someone who knew the walls were closing in. And at the center of it all, Zara Williams remained perfectly still. She had not raised her voice. She had not moved with haste, but her silence was heavy enough to make everyone hold their breath. The crowd leaned forward when she set her briefcase on the counter. The click of the lock snapping open was louder than it should have been, like the sound of a verdict. Slowly, deliberately, she withdrew a leather portfolio, its cover embossed in gold. Brad squinted, trying to read from a distance, his confidence faltering. Zara flipped it open with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. The pages weren't ordinary. They were corporate reports, internal documents stamped confidential. Numbers and signatures no customer should ever see. "Do you know what real standards look like?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "They look like this. Quarterly performance reports showing Store 47 ranking in the bottom 15% for customer satisfaction." Brad's smirk vanished. The crowd erupted in whispers. Zara turned another page, her tone sharpening. 14 formal discrimination complaints in the past 6 months, all dismissed by management. The words struck Janet Morrison like a physical blow. Her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Another page. Sexual harassment settlements buried. Workers' compensation claims denied. OSHA violations ignored. Each revelation peeled away another layer of corporate rot, exposing it to the judgment of the crowd. Phones zoomed in on the documents, screenshots flashing across live streams that were now reaching over 50,000 viewers. Brad's face drained of color. "How did you?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "Those are private company files. You can't have access to those." Zara lifted her eyes for the first time since she opened the portfolio. "You're right," she said evenly. "They are private company files." She reached into her briefcase again, this time drawing out a card holder of platinum and ebony. Every eye in the room locked on her hand as she slid one card free. She held it between 2 fingers and let the words carry across the marble floor. "I'm Zara Williams, Chief Executive Officer of Williams Luxury Group." She let the card fall. It fluttered to the floor between her and Brad like a guillotine blade cutting through the last of his defenses. The crowd gasped as one, a wave of disbelief crashing through the store. Phones nearly slipped from trembling hands. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and it rippled like a prayer. Brad's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked like a man drowning in plain sight. Janet Morrison pressed a hand to her lips, her entire career flashing before her eyes. Williams Luxury Group. The name carried weight. It was the parent company of Luxe Fashion, the empire that owned more than 800 stores across North America. And the woman Brad had slapped in front of 80 witnesses, the woman he had called ghetto and accused of fraud, was the head of it all. Zara's voice was calm, measured, merciless. "You didn't just slap a customer, Mr. Hutchinson. You slapped the CEO of the company that owns this store." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the reaction hit like an explosion. Gasps turned to shouts. Phones tilted higher. Viewers across social media surged, the live stream count spiking past 70,000, then 80, climbing so fast it was impossible to track. Comments poured in, "Fire him. This is history. A queen." Brad stumbled backward, his face pale, his confidence shattered. He looked at the business card still lying on the floor, as though it were a weapon he could not defend against. Janet whispered, "Miss Williams, I had no idea. If I had known." Zara's eyes pinned her where she stood. "If you had known, you would have treated me differently. So the only reason to show dignity is if a customer might be your boss." The question cut deeper than any blade. It wasn't just for Janet. It was for every person watching, in that store and beyond, forced to confront the truth about respect and power. The crowd stood frozen, not just watching a scandal, but witnessing the moment a man's career collapsed, and an empire's secrets spilled into the open. And still Zara did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority filled the room without volume. Brad's arrogance had died in a single sentence, and the world was watching him sink. The marble floor of luxe fashion no longer shone as a temple of wealth. It had become a courtroom. The chandeliers overhead now felt like interrogation lamps, casting harsh light on guilty faces. 80 phones filmed with the precision of sworn stenographers. The defendant sat pale and trembling, his tie loosened, his bravado gone. Brad Hutchinson. And the judge, jury, and executioner was the woman he had slapped only minutes before. The glass doors swung open, and in came the first wave of authority. 3 attorneys in charcoal suits, their briefcases sleek and heavy with papers that could end careers. Behind them, 2 NYPD officers stepped in with the deliberate authority of men who knew how to handle chaos. The crowd parted, cameras following their every move. The transformation was complete. This was no longer a retail store. It was a tribunal. Detective Sarah Chen, 15 years on the force, walked to Zara with a respectful nod. "Miss Williams, we understand there's been an assault." Zara inclined her head slightly, her tone as calm as if she were discussing quarterly earnings. "At approximately 2:15 p.m., Mr. Hutchinson struck me across the face after making racially charged remarks. The entire incident was captured on multiple recordings. A ripple of satisfaction ran through the crowd. They had seen it. They had filmed it. They had proof. One of the attorneys, Marcus Sterling, took a step forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Detective, we have documentation, video from 6 angles, audio capturing every word, and more than 80 eyewitnesses. The evidence is indisputable." Brad's knees seemed to buckle. He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. Janet Morrison, standing stiff at his side, tried to steady the sinking ship. "Miss Williams, perhaps we can resolve this without escalating to law enforcement. This is, after all, a family of brands. Surely we can handle this internally." Zara turned her eyes to Janet, and for the first time her voice sharpened. Internally she repeated, "In the past 30 minutes, our market capitalization has dropped $2.8 billion. The number landed like a thunderclap. The crowd gasped. Phones zoomed in on Zara as she lifted a sleek tablet from her briefcase, its glowing screen displaying live financial data. "Our stock has fallen 12%. Our brand reputation score is at critical levels. Corporate clients have already begun to suspend contracts." Brad blinked rapidly, his face draining of the last of its color. $2.8 billion, he whispered as though the figure itself might crush him. Zara's eyes locked on his, steady and merciless. "That's more damage than a natural disaster." The line cut through the store like a blade, slicing away any illusion that this was a private dispute. The crowd erupted, voices surging, chants rising. Fire him now." The chant grew louder, phones shaking as people recorded the moment justice began to roar. Brad held his head in his hands, his arrogance dissolved into terror. Janet tried again, her words stumbling over themselves. "Surely, Miss Williams, we can frame this as an unfortunate misunderstanding. A training issue, perhaps." Zara cut her off with a look. "Training does not erase a slap in front of 80 witnesses. Training does not erase racial slurs broadcast to 100,000 viewers online. Training does not erase felony assault." Janet fell silent, her lips pressed tight. She knew it was over. The attorneys spread documents across the counter like evidence in a trial. Lawsuits, discrimination complaints, financial analyses, each sheet of paper another nail in the coffin of Brad's career. Sterling's voice carried like a prosecutor. "Based on the evidence, the charges are clear. Assault in the 3rd degree, civil rights violations, possible hate crime enhancements." The crowd responded with a wave of satisfaction. Justice was not only emotional anymore, it was procedural, it was documented, it was inevitable. Detective Chen turned to Brad, her notepad ready. "Mr. Hutchinson, do you understand the charges being considered against you?" Brad's lips trembled, his voice cracked. I didn't know who she was." Zara's head tilted slightly, her eyes unflinching. "You didn't know that black women deserve dignity. You didn't know assault is illegal, regardless of someone's title." The crowd hissed, the weight of her words crashing down on him. He shook his head, collapsing into a chair, his face ashen. Around him, the store no longer looked like a palace. It looked like the ruins of his ambition. Zara closed the tablet with quiet finality and slipped it back into her briefcase. The message was clear. The numbers were irrefutable. The law was undeniable. The world was watching. Brad had not just humiliated himself. He had detonated a corporate bomb, one that would reverberate through boardrooms, stock markets, and headlines. And now he sat at ground zero, choking on the fallout. The marble floors gleamed still, but what they reflected now was not luxury, it was reckoning. Store had turned into something that no one had expected when the day began. It was no longer a showroom for luxury handbags and tailored suits. It was a public tribunal, a courtroom where every shopper, every employee, every camera became witness and jury. Brad Hutchinson sat slumped in a chair, his head bowed, his once perfect suit crumpled like paper. Minutes earlier, he had strutted through these halls with the swagger of a man untouchable. Now his eyes were swollen with tears, his lips trembling as he tried to form words that could not undo what had already been done. "I made a mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking so loudly that even those at the back of the crowd could hear. I didn't mean it. I was angry. I didn't think." But no apology could wipe away the image of his hand striking across a woman's face, nor the venom in his voice when he had said "people like you." Zara stood across from him, calm and upright, a presence steady as iron. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke carried with it the authority of someone who had seen men like Brad crumble before. "Mr. Hutchinson, you are asking for compassion. But tell me, when you humiliated customers, when you dismissed complaints, when you used words meant to reduce people to nothing, where was your compassion then?" Her voice was not angry, but it was sharp enough to cut through him. "You're asking for compassion you never once gave." The crowd reacted with a low murmur, some nodding, others whispering into their phones as the phrase raced across live streams, already becoming a headline. Brad lowered his face into his hands, sobbing openly. "I know," he said. "I know I failed. I don't deserve anything from you." Zara paused, then straightened her shoulders. "You have two choices." Her tone was businesslike, but the silence that followed made it clear this was more than a corporate negotiation. This was sentencing. Choice 1, you submit to arrest, face criminal charges, civil litigation, and you accept that your name will forever be tied to this disgrace. Your career is over. Your family will carry the shame of this moment for years. Brad's body shook harder, the weight of the consequences crashing over him. Choice 2, you agree to become a case study for reform. 200 hours of racial bias training. Public speaking engagements where you will tell this story, not to justify yourself, but to warn others of what prejudice costs. You will work with our legal team to identify and eliminate systemic discrimination in every store. The crowd gasped, surprised by the twist. This was not vengeance. This was transformation. Brad looked up, his eyes red, his breathing uneven. Why would you offer me that after what I did?" Zara's gaze was steady. "Because punishment alone doesn't change people. Education does. And because the people you hurt deserve more than your tears. They deserve to know you will never do this again." He nodded slowly, like a drowning man clutching the edge of a lifeline. "I agree," he whispered. "I'll do it, anything." The attorneys moved quickly, placing a tablet in front of him, the agreement already drafted. His trembling fingers signed the digital line, the cameras capturing every second of his surrender. The crowd erupted in applause, not because they forgave him, but because they recognized the weight of what had just been forced upon him. Then Zara turned her gaze on Janet Morrison. "Ms. Morrison, you supervised this store. 14 discrimination complaints in 6 months. You looked away. You enabled this culture." Janet swallowed hard, her polished exterior cracking. I didn't realize." Zara's eyes narrowed. "You realized enough to know those complaints threatened your numbers. You are guilty of silence." Janet's knees nearly gave out beneath her. "So you will be reassigned. Effective immediately, you will lead our new diversity and inclusion division. Your job will be to dismantle the very system you ignored. Your performance will be measured by customer satisfaction scores from communities of color." Janet blinked in disbelief. This was not termination. This was responsibility. The crowd murmured in approval. It was poetic justice. Zara wasn't interested in scapegoats. She was interested in systemic change. Finally, she turned to Marcus, the security guard who had hesitated to follow Brad's orders earlier. "Marcus, integrity matters. You stood back when you knew something was wrong. That hesitation deserves correction, but your instinct to question authority deserves reward. I want you to join our new customer experience division. You'll train security teams across all our stores in bias recognition and de-escalation." Marcus's eyes widened. "Ma'am, yes, absolutely, yes." The applause that followed was louder this time, relief mixing with admiration. In less than an hour, this flagship store had become a theater of downfall and rebirth. Brad's arrogance reduced to a cautionary tale. Janet's complacency turned into accountability. Marcus's quiet courage elevated into leadership, and Zara Williams stood at the center, not as a victim of a slap, but as the architect of justice, turning humiliation into reform before an audience of hundreds of thousands online. Justice had been delivered, but not in the way anyone expected. It wasn't the easy justice of destruction. It was the harder justice of transformation. 6 months later, the echoes of that afternoon at Lux Fashion had not faded. They had multiplied, rippling outward, until the slap that once humiliated a woman became the spark for a movement that redefined an empire. The flagship store on Fifth Avenue looked different now. The marble floors still gleamed, but the air carried something new: dignity. A sign near the entrance declared all customers deserve respect. Report discrimination instantly through the Lux Respect app. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a promise enforced by technology and accountability. Shoppers noticed, employees noticed, complaints dropped, trust grew. What once was a stage for arrogance had become a model of reform. Across the country, stores began to change, training programs expanded, and customers felt the difference. But the most remarkable transformations were not the systems, they were the people. Brad Hutchinson, once the face of disgrace, now stood behind podiums instead of counters. At Harvard Business School, in front of a packed auditorium of future executives, he told the story of the day he lost everything with one hand. His voice shook, not from fear but from humility. "I thought power was control," he admitted. "I thought power was about who I could keep out. That slap taught me that real power is who you choose to lift up." Students listened, not because they forgave him, but because his fall carried lessons no textbook could. His 200 hours of bias training had grown into a mission, traveling from universities to corporate boardrooms, repeating one truth: prejudice has a cost, and accountability can change a man. Janet Morrison, too, had been transformed. She now led the Diversity and Inclusion Division for Williams Luxury Group, a role she never imagined and one she could not escape. Quarterly reports showed an 89% reduction in discrimination complaints across all locations. She didn't deliver presentations from a place of pride. She delivered them from a place of responsibility. The woman who once looked away now forced others to look directly at the truth. Marcus, the quiet security guard, now trained more than 200 officers across the company. He taught them not just how to recognize bias, but how to stand up when they saw it. His classes were filled with real stories, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen silence do damage. He had become the proof that integrity, when rewarded, could ripple outward as forcefully as prejudice. And at the center of it all was Zara Williams. Her face graced the cover of Time magazine under the headline CEO of the Year, though she knew awards were not the victory. The victory was cultural, systemic, visible in every smile from a customer who once feared being dismissed. At a TED talk that reached 15 million viewers, she stood in a simple black dress, her presence commanding yet understated. "The slap was loud," she said, her voice carrying into a hushed auditorium. "But the silence before change was louder." Those words became the line quoted in articles, shared across social media, written on posters in classrooms and offices. They were not just about her story. They were about every story of injustice that risked being ignored. The hashtag Lux model trended for months, used by workers across industries to demand better from their employers. Other retailers followed, implementing their own apps, their own bias training, their own accountability systems. What began as a humiliation in a single store had become a blueprint for corporate reform. And yet, for all the progress, Zara knew the fight wasn't finished. Change was never permanent. It had to be protected, nurtured, pushed forward by every person willing to say enough. As she ended her talk, she left the audience with the same challenge she left the world. Real stories change systems. Have you witnessed discrimination? Have you stayed silent when you should have spoken? Your voice matters. Share it, tell it, use it. Because one story can light a fire, and a fire can change the world. The auditorium rose in applause, but the true measure of success was not in the clapping. It was in the conversations that would happen afterward, in the courage sparked in ordinary people who saw themselves in her story. 6 months later, the slap was no longer just a moment of shame for one man. It was a reminder to millions that even the smallest act of cruelty can topple empires, and even the smallest act of courage can rebuild them. The revolution wasn't over. It was only beginning. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.